In 1980, a small fishing town across the border from Hong Kong was home to about 330,000 people. Tiny, by Chinese standards, especially since the country had just become the first nation in history to cross 1 billion in population. The town was called Shenzhen, and most people had never heard of it. Then something changed. Under the direction of Deng Xiaoping, China's new paramount leader, this unremarkable town was given special economic privileges. Permission to trade with the outside capitalist world. Permission to do business differently than the rest of the country. Permission to experiment. What happened next was extraordinary. In the 40 years since that decision, Shenzhen transformed into one of the largest and most economically influential cities on Earth. By 2018, its economy had surpassed Hong Kong, a global center of commerce that had stood for hundreds of years. Today, Shenzhen is the 8th largest city in the world by population, a metropolis of innovation, technology, and wealth that didn't exist in any meaningful form just 4 decades ago. For decades, many believed it was only a matter of time before China became the world's dominant superpower. Its rapid economic rise, massive infrastructure projects, and expanding global influence made it seem unstoppable. The Chinese century was coming. Everyone said so. Economists, politicians, business leaders, they all saw the same trajectory pointing upward forever. As the United States faces its own challenges and the global order shifts, many are looking to China to finally pull ahead like it's been expected to for years. Maybe this still could be the Chinese century. It's just starting a quarter of the way through, right? But it's important to address that China has its own problems. Serious problems. Problems that might be just as bad if not worse than America's. The difference is that China is better at hiding them, which is why we need to look at these issues one by one to understand how the reported numbers might not tell the whole truth, why debt has become China's biggest threat, and whether the country is truly on the verge of collapse or just facing temporary setbacks that every growing economy experiences. This is China's economic reality, growth, debt, and an uncertain future that nobody can predict with any confidence. Now, before we dive too deep into China's current problems, we need to address the elephant in the room. The country causes international tensions. Proposed hostilities with Taiwan, one of the most technologically significant places in the world. Human rights issues that are well documented. And simply being a dramatic shake-up to a global status quo that has had the United States exist as the dominant economic power for the last century. For these reasons and others, it's understandable that people are eager to hear news about some kind of impending collapse. A collapse of a country that is now the second most powerful economy in the world. But just because people want something to be true doesn't mean it is. And it was just over a year ago that economists were making these exact same predictions about China's imminent demise. Since then, a few things have changed. The country more or less completely reopened after the longest and most severe lockdowns in the world. Those lockdowns controlled when people could leave their homes, go to work, go shopping, travel, start a business, or really do much of anything that generates economic activity. After restrictions lifted about a year ago, the hope was simple. Economic activity would bounce back. People would go out and do everything they weren't able to do while stuck inside for the better part of 3 years. Spending would explode. Growth would return to the double-digit rates the country had enjoyed before. This did happen, but not as intensely as economists and the government predicted. The country went from posting close to double-digit annual growth rates before the pandemic to around 5% today. That means year over year, the Chinese economy is producing 5% more goods and services than it was 12 months ago. A lot of media outlets and even some economists have pointed to this as a sign that the end is near for China, but they mostly fail to explain why. 5% is low by Chinese standards, sure, and it's following a trend of downward growth. Statistics that have existed for just over a decade, but that growth rate would be remarkable in most countries, let alone the second largest economy in the world. Advanced Western economies strive for growth rates of around 2 to 3% annually, effectively half of what China is achieving, and even then, plenty don't hit that target. So why are growth figures that would be a miracle in the West considered a crisis in China? It all has to do with expectations. Imagine someone earning $50,000 a year who plans their long-term budget around getting 10% annual pay increases every year. They might take on a bigger mortgage than they really should. Maybe have an extra kid. Assuming their income will grow enough to cover those expenses, they adjust their spending, saving and investing strategy based on an assumption of strong career growth. Now imagine that person's salary only grows by 5% instead of 10. Not bad, right? Still growth. Still moving forward. But suddenly, the mortgage payment is harder to make. The expenses for that extra child are tighter than expected. The budget doesn't work anymore because it was built for 10%, not 5%. That's China's problem. The entire economy was built around the assumption that growth would remain much stronger than 5% for much longer than it has. The comparison of personal income to a country's GDP isn't perfect, but it highlights something critical. GDP is a measurement that resets every year. Just like how much money a person earns in a year also resets every year. But both contribute directly to wealth and debt levels over time. Higher GDP, like higher income, means a country can pay off debt and build up assets faster. That's why economists talk about debt to GDP the same way regular finance talks about debt to income. It's a measurement of whether you can actually afford what you owe. This becomes especially important when you consider that growth rates compound. The difference between 5% and 10% annual growth over a decade is almost double the end output. An economy with a $1 trillion GDP will have a $1.65 trillion GDP with 5% growth. But it will have a $2.71 trillion GDP with 10% growth. China built its economy around the assumption that growth would remain much stronger than 5% for much longer. Major investments made by the government at all levels, by companies within the country, and perhaps most crucially by individual households, were all based on the idea that the economy would continue growing like it had between 1980 and 2010. Commentators have poked fun at things like ghost cities, entire cities developed on the outskirts of existing major centers that could house millions of people but never had anybody move into them. They sat mostly empty for years. Other commentators defended this practice, pointing to instances where these ghost cities eventually filled up with people. The reality, as with most things, lies somewhere in the middle. These development projects took investments from governments to provide infrastructure, from companies to construct buildings, and from individuals to buy apartments in cities where nobody lived yet. With the country growing as fast as it was, the expectation seemed reasonable. Eventually, these areas would fill with people moving into new centers. The rate at which it was happening meant it made sense to plan ahead. Build now, fill later. Growth would take care of the rest. But with any style of economic planning like this, even a drop in growth that would still be strong by Western standards could mean the difference between an entire city being filled or remaining completely empty until everybody involved runs out of money. This is where economists really should have known better. The simple fact that internal migration rates from the countryside to major cities had been slowing for decades was visible in the data. For the first time in recorded history outside of a war, the population of China was decreasing, endlessly building with the expectation that the country would grow into everything just wasn't going to last forever. Real estate became the most obvious and problematic sector, where this expectation of strong future growth encouraged reckless optimism at every level of the economy. But it wasn't the only place. Everything from infrastructure development to trade deals, all the way up to massive international projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, were made with the assumption that the Chinese economy would swiftly grow into markets it wasn't yet big enough to fully utilize. Overly optimistic future planning is one thing. It doesn't constitute a crisis by itself, but it might when we consider the one thing that is still growing rapidly in China: debt. China has always had a reputation for being a prudent saver on both national and individual levels. The country does have the world's largest foreign currency reserves, but it also has a rapidly growing pile of debt that most people don't fully understand. China's national debt to GDP ratio is about 77%. That's up significantly in recent decades, but still perfectly healthy. The United States, by comparison, has a debt to GDP ratio of around 122%. High, but not really anything to panic about. The thing with China, though, is that national debt doesn't tell the full story. The country has either intentionally or accidentally fallen into a situation where none of their debt metrics look too concerning individually, but collectively they tell a very grim story. National debt only measures borrowing by the national government. On top of that, there's provincial debt, which is more concerning because provinces within China don't have the authority to print money. They can become insolvent in ways the national government cannot. Exact figures on provincial debt are hard to track down because different regions report their borrowing in different ways. Some don't report it to anybody except the central government. And potentially embarrassing economic statistics in China are frequently misreported anyway. There's a quick but very funny side note. Air. Several stories have emerged of provincial governments painting their grass green, setting up completely fake pieces of infrastructure like drains that lead nowhere, and sticking rocks on top of rebar to make it look like flowers in a field. All of this ahead of visits from central government officials. These are individual reports, sure, but if they're willing to go to that much effort and cause that much damage just to save face when high-level government officials come to town, it's not outside the realm of possibility that they would also massage financial figures to look better than reality. The best estimates by Goldman Sachs put total provincial debt in China at the equivalent of over $23 trillion. That's effectively 150% of the country's total economic output, on top of the 77% from the national government. That provincial borrowing was mainly done to fund big infrastructure projects, with the anticipation that the country's industry would grow to fill them. Major cities all over the country were becoming very wealthy, and other regions didn't want to be left behind. The main source of revenue for municipal governments is selling state-owned land to developers on 70 or 99-year leases. But they can only sell that land if people are willing to buy property. And people are only willing to buy property if the local government is investing in big projects that make the area attractive. Combined PR. Provincial and national government debt, if the estimates are correct, would be over 200% of the country's GDP. That's where alarm bells start ringing even in the most resilient economies. Now, to be fair, individual states within the United States also have their own debts. Collectively, they add up to $3.3 trillion in total borrowing. Still significant, but a tiny fraction of provincial government borrowing in China, which is overall still a smaller economy in nominal terms. But the debt problem doesn't stop there. Far from it. A lot of borrowing to fund government initiatives in China isn't done by the government directly. Instead, it's done through thousands of state-owned companies. Large state-owned companies have been the primary driving forces behind major projects with less than amazing outcomes both within the country and internationally. The Belt and Road Initiative in particular, China's grand plan to fund infrastructure development in emerging economies to build trade partnerships and spread influence, was mostly funded and built by state-owned companies. China Construction Bank, China National Petroleum Corporation, China State Construction Engineering Corporation. The Belt and Road Initiative has not been a resounding success. It led to a lot of lending that looks unlikely to ever be repaid. It's turning China into a global debt collector, which runs contrary to the plan's original goal of getting developing countries on China's side. Today, it has more or less been abandoned as no major new projects have been announced. At home, the story isn't much better for Chinese state-owned corporations. Many of these companies are just regular property developers that assisted regional governments in building out cities. And that industry has been plagued with problems ever since the spectacular collapse of Evergrande, which itself wasn't state-owned but brought a lot of developers that were down with it. On top of all this, companies like China Railway Corporation have overinvested in infrastructure based on expectations of future growth. They've taken on debt burdens that would only be manageable if the country's economic activity continued to grow very rapidly. China's state-owned companies have total debts of over $15.6 trillion. That brings the running total to $52.3 trillion, or roughly 300% of the country's GDP. And this is all before considering perhaps the most important indebted group, regular everyday households. Chinese households have also borrowed heavily, mostly to invest in real estate. In major cities, housing was among the most unaffordable in the world. People bought into the dream of cities like Shenzhen, going from a glorified fishing village to one of the global centers of commerce within their lifetime. Assuming economic growth kept going, this success story could be replicated in hundreds of other cities around the country. In Man. Why instances it was. Family members pooling together their life savings to buy a rundown one-bedroom apartment in a complex with terrible building standards sounds foolish in hindsight. But if these cities continued to grow like they had been, it would be a good investment, including household debt that has mostly been directed toward unproductive assets that are now losing market value. The country has a debt burden potentially as high as 360% of its GDP, and if that wasn't concerning enough already, it's becoming worse due to deflation. In the past few years, we've talked a lot about inflation for obvious reasons. Prices going up, money losing value, central banks raising interest rates to cool things down. But China is facing the opposite problem, deflation. Prices are going down. And that's causing economists to get very worried. Theoretically, cheaper stuff should be a positive economic outcome. Who doesn't want to pay less for things? But deflation causes some serious problems, and understanding why requires looking beneath the surface. For starters, deflation is often a symptom of bigger underlying issues. It's not a problem by itself, just like a faster heart rate isn't a problem by itself. But if it's unexplained and goes on long enough, it can be a sign of something else going very badly wrong. Most deflation occurs when consumers aren't spending as much. Businesses are then forced to lower prices to encourage purchases and compete for the few. Customers still spending. The reason consumers spend less is either because they're earning less due to higher unemployment or because they're worried about the future and trying to save money. Either scenario is bad for an economy. Deflation itself, if it goes on long enough, can dramatically slow down growth. A small amount of inflation can actually be good for an economy as long as wages keep up with it. A small bump in nominal wages every year encourages people to go out and spend or invest their money, even if their real buying power hasn't actually increased. Deflation does the opposite. If money is buying more every year, businesses find it harder to give people wage increases. Long term, they might even need to reduce wages or lay people off. Even though people's incomes are technically becoming higher in real terms, it's harder for them to see it the same way they would, with a bigger number hitting their bank account every month. People with money to spend and invest become less likely to do it because if money is buying more every year, it makes sense to just sit on it completely risk-free, especially in an environment like China at the moment, where investments that were once considered the safest, houses, are literally being demolished because it's no longer worth keeping them standing. In China, this is especially bad because a lot of their economic growth still depends on low-cost manufacturing. If deflation persists and wages aren't lowered in line with it, China will continue to lose its dominance in this industry to other regional rivals like Vietnam, India, and Indonesia. All of these issues have a common thread. They would be fine if the country still had double-digit growth, and nobody can predict the future, least of all economists. But there was no reason to expect that now would be the time the economy slowed down. By global standards, China is still at best a middle-income country. A large part of their population still lives in relative poverty. There was plenty of headroom for economic prosperity, but the slowdown is here, and it's revealing problems that were always there but were hidden by rapid growth. Now we need to address something critical. How do we even know what's really happening in China's economy? Because the truth is, we don't. Not really. Anytime someone makes a video or writes an article about China's economy, there should be a big disclaimer. Economic figures from Chinese agencies are potentially altered by different levels of government to present a more positive image. This could include anything from inflating output figures to misrepresenting employment data. There are logical reasons different levels of government within China would try to do this. More funding for local projects. Gaining favor with party leaders for delivering good results. On an international level, presenting a strong face to potential allies and adversaries alike, misrepresenting economic figures does more harm than bruising e.g. OS and allocating credit where it's not due. It can seriously impact the quality of life of billions of people, and it makes it nearly impossible for outsiders to understand what's really happening. It's important to recognize that misrepresenting economic statistics isn't a problem unique to China. But China is the second largest economy in the world, and it has a reputation more than any other country for this practice, which makes it a great case study for learning what to look for if any economy is doing the same thing. So what evidence suggests China is misrepresenting figures? The answer starts with understanding how difficult it is to measure GDP accurately. Consider Australia, a very transparent and reliable country. The World Bank estimates that in 2021, Australia's output was $1,542,660,000,000. The IMF says it was $1,724,787,000,000. The United Nations says it was $1,423,473,000,000. These estimates can't all be accurate. There's a variance of more than $300 billion here, roughly the economy of Portugal. The reason is that all these organizations use very different techniques to collect and process data. What's more, these figures make a mistake economists should watch out for. They've oversold their precision. There's no way an organization can measure the total output of any national economy down to the closest $1 million. Yet they express figures to this point, which gives the wrong impression of how precise these numbers really are. In advanced economies with formalized financial systems, government agencies use data collected by other organizations. The US Bureau of Economic Analysis mostly uses data from the IRS and Customs. The process is transparent. Most governments want it that way. The problem for China is that a large portion of its economy is still informal. Only around 2% of China's population pays regular taxes. Getting a clear economic picture using tax records just isn't feasible. They have no option but to rely on more first-hand data collection, which is prone to manipulation. We also have to address corruption. It happens in China. So when a massive economy is dealing with complex figures collected and interpreted by many layers of government employees, all with a vested interest in presenting positive messages to superiors, it's no wonder figures become unreliable. There's also the compounding effect of figures reported every year. A researcher at Stanford published a paper arguing that after fabricating one report, leaders struggled to go back to accurate numbers because they would have to report lower than actual growth to rebalance. If a local government leader accidentally or willfully overestimated output by 1% in a year, they need to add an extra 1% to next year's figures, or it looks like they went backwards. Do this long enough, and the gap between correct figures and last year's figures becomes so large that reporting correctly would cause such a drastic drop it would spark an investigation. Even if officials didn't want to report false figures, it would be in their best interest to keep doing it, because the punishment would be severe. The Chinese government recognized this problem as early as the 1990s. A leaked comment by a top Chinese official openly admitted that GDP figures were purely man-made. Because of this systemic problem, international organizations, and even the Chinese government itself, no longer use data collected by provincial governments without making corrections. The problem is that the National Bureau of Statistics of China freely admits to making discretionary adjustments to data and provides no transparency on what those adjustments are. The American Federal Reserve argued that this lack of transparency is actually worse than blatantly false figures because it's harder to know what was changed. So it's fairly obvious to most economists that Chinese economic figures are unreliable and overestimated rather than underestimated. The next question is how to make better estimates. One popular method is measuring light emitted from a country at night using satellite imagery. The theory is that a country emits more light when it has more economic activity. Road lights, factory lights, car lights, stadium lights, all direct results O. F. Economic output. More light, higher GDP. This is fun because we can test it. South Korea with a GDP of $1.8 trillion lights up brightly at night. North Korea with a GDP of roughly $29 billion is almost completely dark. The theory works in extreme cases, but there are problems. Countries with larger populations naturally use more lights. Countries with heavy industry use more light than service sector economies. Cultural differences around how bright residents want cities matter. Compare Shanghai to Paris. One is much more lit up, but Paris is actually the larger economic center. An economist at the University of Chicago published a paper suggesting China's growth in light output over previous decades was not sufficient to align with claimed growth in overall economic output. He found that autocratic governments in general tend to overstate actual economic figures by an average of 35% when measured using light output. The same paper argued China's growth may have been overestimated by more than double in the years between 1993 and 2012. But there's a catch. Autocracies, especially those with communist focus, tend to emphasize heavy industry even when very poor. This means baseline light output is already high, and changes in total light output wouldn't be as heavily affected by households growing wealthier. Lenin himself famously said that communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country. Communist Nat. Ions obviously prioritize electricity supply. These alternative ways to measure GDP can verify or raise doubts over different figures, but they struggle to come up with accurate estimates themselves. For the most part, that's good enough. To actual decision makers and even economies themselves, GDP figures don't matter nearly as much as you might think. GDP growth is coveted because it can directly lead to improvements in living standards. GDP growth papers over a lot of other problems. People are willing to put up with a lot if they think they're getting richer. But it's definitely possible for living standards and economic influence to decrease even when output is increasing. If you need to see this counterintuitive trend in action, look no further than China. So the question becomes, is China's economy about to collapse? And the answer depends entirely on what we mean by collapse. If we're defining collapse as total breakdown of civil order, people marching in the streets, governments being deposed, something like the Arab Spring, then sure, it could happen the same way America could have collapsed during the financial crisis. Theoretically possible, but extremely unlikely. If government leadership gets backed into a corner and tries something desperate, like invading Taiwan, then yes, it could quickly turn into a failed state. But that's not a situation unique to China. Any country in a precarious position faces similar risks. Another potential scenario wouldn't be a collapse in the traditional sense, but a regression toward becoming a closed-off, centrally planned economy again. We can already see this playing out to some degree. The country is becoming stricter about who leaves and enters. It has taken on a more nationalistic persona. It's aligning with countries getting cut off from the rest of the world. But this would be a slow, gradual decline rather than a sudden collapse, and it would be harder to pull off than it was decades ago. One reason having a wealthy population is fantastic is that they have the capacity to be politically active. China's population, while not wealthy by Western standards, isn't living meal to meal like when the country was closed off. It's much harder to subjugate a population that has tasted wealth and freedom. Not impossible, but much harder. Now, for more realistic reasons why collapse probably won't happen. First, China can afford economic setbacks. It's been home to the most intense period of economic growth in history, going from a mostly agrarian backwater to the second largest economy in the world in the span of someone's working career. Lots of countries have economic setbacks without devolving into revolution. What's more, a bit of slowdown might be exactly what the country needs. Modern economies run on business cycles, rough patterns of booms and busts with a frequency of around a decade. This pattern is mostly caused by debt. When people on average are taking on debt, the economy does well. When people are paying off or defaulting on debt, the economy slows down. While slowdowns are painful, if well managed, they play an important role in long-term health. Downturns weed out underperforming businesses, products, and employees. Only the most competitive and efficient entities survive. On a human level, that sounds terrible, but long-term, it means the economy can bounce back stronger. A pullback in the Chinese economy, if managed properly, could be a huge opportunity to shift away from overdependence on real estate and infrastructure, focus more on value-adding industries like high-tech manufacturing, research and development, tourism and finance. The Chinese economy is also more robust than most economists give it credit for. This might be confusing since we just said the biggest industries are built on shaky foundations, but these factors aren't mutually exclusive. Real estate and infrastructure industries are crumbling, literally and figuratively. But the Chinese government is more than capable of controlling damage from these issues in the short term. China has the most foreign currency reserves of any nation by a huge margin. In a worst-case scenario, it could hold off bank runs just by printing money and dispersing it through state-owned banks. Normally this would cause inflation, but China can afford that right now. One positive side effect of consumer hesitancy is that China isn't having the same inflation problems as Western countries. The Chinese central bank has actually bucked the global trend and is lowering interest rates to offset pain from the housing market collapse. It can further prevent knock-on effects by using foreign currency reserves to protect the value of its currency so it doesn't end up like Turkey or Venezuela. Turns out having a $3.4 trillion pile of money is very effective at shoring up food security too. China already imports more food than it exports. If it needs to spend extra money making sure citizens are fed, It's more than happy to do so. There are also non-economic factors. The Chinese population doesn't have the same opportunity for regime-changing civil unrest as populations in democracies. The government is authoritarian and monitors everybody closely. People voice frustrations, especially about not getting houses they paid for. But these protests aren't directed at the government or country. They're public ways for people to ask their government to bail them out. Chances are the government probably will bail them out. People are happy to give up liberties if they're getting rich. But entire families have pulled life savings of multiple generations to afford modest homes that won't be delivered. The government will likely invest in building projects to soften the blow. Only now, instead of building roads to nowhere, it has the opportunity to build housing people already paid for. It's another win-win. Economic stimulus at a time the country actually needs it, and avoiding a situation where tens of millions of people have nothing to lose. The kinds of situations that tend to get revolutionary. Most reasonable economists predict these issues will cause the end of strong, sustained growth in China. Many point to Japan, another country that grew rapidly thanks to manufacturing and exports. Their competitive advantage faded as the population became wealthier, and manufacturing moved to places like China. They had an overinflated housing market that dragged the economy down and caused prolonged stagnation. Japan also suffers from an aging population. The parallels are remarkable, but China is not Japan. For starters, China is much poorer than Japan was when stagnation began. In 1995, Japan had a GDP per capita of $45,000. Today, almost 30 years later, China has a GDP per capita of $10,500. Yes, Japan's economy stagnated with no real sustained GDP growth over 30 years. Yes, it dealt with stagnation well. It's still a very stable, safe, productive economy providing good living standards. If China's economy stagnated now, it wouldn't be any of those things, because most people would still be very poor by global standards. China is also more corrupt and less representative than Japan was. Since the end of World War II, Japan has been a functioning democracy. People have the choice and power to vote the party out if they see fit. Chinese citizens don't have that luxury. If sentiment shifts toward wanting change, they don't have an easy, non-violent way to pursue it. There's a good chance that if China were a democracy, the Communist Party would be continually re-elected. For the majority of people, the last 30 years under their rule have been rewarding. People put up with a lot if they see living conditions improving. But historically, economic conditions have been primary, deciding factors in whether governments get re-elected. If people can't vote their government out, tensions build up. The amount of power and lack of oversight the government has means corruption is a way of life. In a weird way, some corruption has helped the economy grow because businesses can cut through red tape with small bribes. But if the economy isn't growing, corruption will eat it alive. Paying bribes to look the other way on zoning laws or pollution standards has negative consequences, but not the type paid for with money immediately. So where does this leave us? China isn't collapsing tomorrow. The predictions of imminent doom are overblown, just like they've been overblown for the past decade. But the problems are real, the debt is real, the slowdown is real, and the challenges ahead are significant. The Chinese century everyone predicted might still happen, just not in the way anyone expected. Not through unstoppable growth and global dominance, but through managing decline better than competitors, through weathering economic storms while maintaining enough stability to keep the population from revolting. The truth is that nobody knows what comes next. Not the Chinese government, not Western economists, not anyone. China is navigating uncharted territory. An economy this large has never slowed down from this kind of growth while carrying this much debt in a political system. This authoritarian, the Chinese century might still come, but it will look very different than anyone imagined back when Shenzhen was just a fishing village of 330,000 people. And whether that's good or bad depends entirely on who you ask and what happens next.